Welcome to my presentation, Something Wicked This Way Comes, Towards a Meta-Understanding of the Shakespeare Authorship Debate. My name is Michael Dudley. I'm a librarian at the University of Winnipeg and the author of the 2023 book, The Shakespeare Authorship Question and Philosophy, Knowledge, Rhetoric, Identity from Cambridge Scholars Publishing. This presentation will be based primarily on chapters 1, 3, and 6 of my book. In his 2021 history of the Oxfordian movement, Shakespeare Revolutionized, independent Shakespeare scholar James Warren presents what he refers to as the 12 mental revolutions downstream of J. Thomas Looney's 1920 book, Shakespeare Identified, that the public was required to undergo in order to accept the Oxfordian thesis and surrender the Stratfordian one. These included fundamental transformations of our understandings of the circumstances of the composition of the plays and poems, the significance of their internal contents, the extent to which contemporaries borrowed from Shakespeare and not the other way around, and Shakespeare's place in Elizabethan society. What I propose in my book is to add a 13th mental revolution to those articulated by Warren, that Oxfordians now need to forward a meta-understanding, an understanding of our understanding of the authorship debate itself, including the bases and justifications of competing knowledge claims, with a particular focus on the role of institutions in forming, reproducing, and asserting those claims. To encourage this meta-understanding, I make the following argument. The institutional and cultural resistance to doubt about the authorship of the works known as Shakespeare's is rooted in ideologically motivated truth claims arrived at through unreliable belief formation and knowledge generation practices and reinforced through a specific suite of rhetorical strategies and modes of public persuasion. Ultimately, my question is, how is it possible that all of our educational and cultural institutions could have been so fundamentally wrong about something so important? And what might explain their continued defense of and adherence to this epistemological error? In my 2023 Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference presentation, Validating the Oxfordian Thesis Using Theories of Knowledge, Justification, and Truth, available on the SOF's YouTube channel, I explained some of the core epistemological theories used in the book as external disinterested criteria by which anyone can assess the merits of the Stratfordian and Oxfordian claims. Now I would like to move from these theoretical perspectives to considering the debate's institutional dimensions, which is to say the authorship question as a problem of public policy, so we can gain an understanding of the nature of the barriers to incorporating the authorship question in mainstream institutions, including public school curricula. To do this will require that we establish what is known as objectual knowledge, or a domain-level knowledge of a topic by means of a theory. Holding objectual knowledge of the Shakespeare authorship debate means understanding it as a domain, its history, its contexts, institutional dimensions, and associated social and cultural forces, as well as the bodies of theory necessary to situate and understand these factors. I propose that we use the theories of wicked problems and political liberalism. The central problem articulated in my book isn't the question of Shakespeare's authorship itself, which most of us believe to have been solved over a century ago, but rather the combination of absolute certainty and institutionalized studied incuriousness with which it is regarded by the mainstream academy and our cultural institutions. I characterize this problem in the book as a wicked one, a term often used in the field of city planning, my former career. In their classic 1973 paper, Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning, authors Horst W. J. Rittel and Melvin M. Weber first introduced the idea of wicked problems, or those highly complex social policy issues faced by pluralist societies for which no clear definition, solution, or test is known to exist, such as urban planning issues and, significantly for our purposes, changes to public education curricula. Each problem, they argued, may be a symptom of still another problem. To call a problem wicked isn't to say that the problem is bad, only that resolving it to everyone's satisfaction in a pluralist democratic society is often not only difficult but impossible because of, quote, the differentiation of values on the part of the public makes it impossible to pursue unitary aims, end quote, or a unitary conception of the public good. This inherent wickedness makes it essential that we grasp the broader institutional and cultural factors that dominate belief formation and knowledge production concerning Shakespeare. I identify these in terms of first-order circumjacent characteristics, that is, surrounding closely on all sides, which in their cumulative force make basic processes of belief and knowledge formation about Shakespeare so problematic, the second-order academic culture, which makes acknowledging, discussing, and addressing these conditions so challenging, and the tertiary cultural climate, which makes it imperative that we find a way to do so. Circumjacent characteristics. 1. Lack of shared terminology. At a basic level, this debate is hampered, as we all know, by an essential disagreement and confusion over what Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure referred to as the signifier and the signified. While both refer in their writings to Shakespeare, Stratfordians and Oxfordians, and post-Stratfordian skeptics in general, use the term in entirely different ways. The two sides share the same vocabulary, but not, as it were, the same dictionary. For the latter groups, Shakespeare denotes the author of the works, whomever that was, with Oxfordians finding the claim for Edward de Vere's authorship the most compelling, while the William Shakespeare of record is seen as an entirely conventional, if litigious, grain merchant of no known literary ability whatsoever. Stratfordians, however, see Shakespeare as denoting a man who was born and died in Stratford-upon-Avon and who became the greatest writer in the English language. Admitting no reason to allow a distinction to be made between the author and the gentleman of record, Stratfordians view all contemporary references to Shakespeare as a confirmation as to the literary reputation of the Stratfordian. Skeptics see this as a grand and fatal conflation. Because of this disagreement, there is, number 2, widespread ignorance and misunderstanding. Owing to this fundamental confusion and conflation of historic individuals, it is extremely difficult for the average layperson to understand the issue, or indeed the mainstream media to communicate it. The tautology "Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare" assumes that there was, irrefutably, a known historic author who lived in Stratford-upon-Avon and whose authorship is now being unjustifiably questioned. Because tautologies are, strictly speaking, impossible to refute logically, the authorship question is easily framed as highly irrational. 3. Scholarly disincentives to genuine biographical inquiry. As far back as 1898, Sidney Lee wrote in his foundational biography, A Life of William Shakespeare, that, quote, "It is dangerous to read into Shakespeare's dramatic utterances allusions to his personal experience," end quote, because to do so would, quote, "underrate his intuitive power of realizing life under almost every aspect by force of his imagination," end quote. Many Shakespeare scholars and biographers would follow this advice, openly eschewing autobiographical readings of the plays. This approach would also resonate with mid-20th century scholars associated with the New Criticism, which viewed biographical considerations as a distraction from close readings of the texts themselves, and particularly so following the publication of Roland Barthes' highly influential 1967 essay, The Death of the Author, which argued that literary criticism need take no account of authors' biographies or authorial intentions. Post-Barthes, then, the project of Shakespearean biography was transformed into something almost unrecognizable as traditional biography. In the new millennium, however, many Shakespeare biographers have made an art of mining the plays and poems, often by psychologizing them, to furnish thoroughly fictional depictions of their subject. Neither of these approaches are amenable to the project of supplanting Shakespeare's biography with Oxford's. For the Barthes-informed literary critic, biographical facts are of little interest anyways, while for the literary biographer, embracing the richly documented life of Edward de Vere would obviate the primary attraction of the particular genre that is Shakespearean biography, which is to say the opportunity to exhibit one's own imaginative literary flourishes in the guise of biographical scholarship. 4. Conceptual diffusions associated with the author function. In lieu of a substantive and documented biography, the name Shakespeare has come to denote less an historic individual than it has a vast array of cultural meanings and resonances. This is entirely consistent with what French philosopher Michel Foucault articulated in his famous 1969 lecture, What is an Author? That authorial names have significance beyond mere biography, such as what he called the author function signifies broader forms of knowledge, serving a classificatory function. Such a name, Foucault wrote, permits one to group together a certain number of texts, define them, differentiate them from, and contrast them to others, end quote. An excellent example of this phenomenon at work is that the contributors to the 2014 book Shakespeare and the Digital World refer to Shakespeare as a cultural phenomenon, a commodity of the heritage industry, a brand, a global cultural field, and a cultural concept, but almost never as an actual individual about whom something verifiable might be discovered. The vast and profound scale of Shakespeare's author function across the globe is such that, for many people and purposes, it would appear that actual biographical facts may seem to be entirely unnecessary, and, indeed, detract from his thoroughly transcendent nature. Which leads us to 5, the quasi-religious nature of the subject. Given this transcendence, the very words we use to discuss Shakespeare are, unsurprisingly, steeped in the language of the sacred. Shakespeare is the divine William, and his alleged hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon is a shrine of bardolatry, while those who doubt all of this are deemed to be heretics. He is, as Harold Bloom has it, a mortal god, with the consequence that every institution concerned with studying him and preserving his memory are lent a patina of this religiosity. As Elizabeth Winkler puts it in her book Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies, in Shakespeare and Stratford-upon-Avon, England acquired, quote, its own Jesus, Bethlehem, and manger, end quote. This veneer of faith then encompasses Shakespeare scholars themselves, the knowledge associated with Shakespeare apparently being so arcane that only a very few of the most brilliant minds can access it, thereby reinforcing 6, the elevated epistemic status and authority of Shakespeare scholars. The linkage between the sacred object of Shakespeare and the high status accorded to the study of his work was no historical accident. Again, Elizabeth Winkler shows how the establishment of the study of English literature was, from its beginning, imbued with religious significance in an era of industrialization and declining faith. It is no wonder that among the many disciplines taught in post-secondary institutions, Shakespeare scholarship in departments of literature is held in particular esteem, a status which academics are dedicated to protecting. The authority of Shakespeare scholars as regards the authorship thus remains unchallenged from within the Academy. This unwarranted status contributes in turn to 7, the isolation of Shakespeare as a subject of inquiry. Being an historiographic problem, the study of the life and work of Shakespeare is or should be the subject of interdisciplinary attention. Yet the field's perceived exceptionalism and isolation from the rest of the Academy and its theorizing, combined with the underlying disincentives to inquiry referred to above, leaves its core subject, the life of the author Shakespeare, as dramatically underdetermined, with serious consequences for its believability. As library science scholar Birger Horland puts it, quote, "If a piece of research is reflecting a reality, then this will be confirmed by other researchers and practitioners, and knowledge will tend to grow in a cumulative way. On the other hand, if a field of research is isolated, it might well be an indication that the field is just construing some kind of pseudo-knowledge based on a professional ideology." End quote. Lacking the same theoretical attention that might ordinarily attend a figure of his stature, his highly improbable biography is, by omission, affirmed. Yet behind this omission also lies a political rationale, which is 8. Political bias towards egalitarianism. Because post-Stratfordians are arrayed against a narrative of an everyman out of a Horatio Alger novel, while Oxfordians are particularly championing a member of the higher aristocracy, doubters routinely face accusations of snobbery and elitism, effectively associated with political conservatism. As Elizabeth Winkler puts it, quote, "No one wants the story of Shakespeare as a member of the 1%, end quote. The Stratfordian assumption about a social climbing local boy made good both affirms our democratic biases and makes post-Stratfordians, and Oxfordians in particular, come across as politically distasteful. All of the above then creates the ideal climate for 9. Cultural and institutional inertia. Western letters have adopted a general and apparent satisfaction with the remote, exceptional secular saint to whom no conventional theorizing, understanding, or measures need apply. A major underlying force in this regard must surely be the sunk costs associated with pathway dependence in the Shakespeare industry. Questioning or altering course on institutional positions on the authorship would involve derailing countless scholarly careers and ensure the obsolescence of entire libraries of books. This inertia is enforced by the considerable political and economic power of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, which has a massive financial stake in perpetuating the tourism industry in Stratford-upon-Avon. Anyone who resists this inertia is thus subject to, number 10, marginalization and disapprobation. With the weight of so many established institutions reinforcing the traditional biography, for all of these reasons and more, it is all too easy to dismiss skepticism and Oxfordianism as fringe conspiracy theories unworthy of serious consideration. Now let's consider, authorship question aside, the climate for academic freedom in general. On its face, the authorship question should ideally be seen as just one among many academic controversies about which scholars in many fields debate on an ongoing basis, and always have done so, such as the controversy regarding the source of the calamity that wiped out the dinosaurs. These sorts of debates are expected to resolve themselves over a matter of decades through, as Jonathan Rauch puts it, the accumulation of evidence and gradual force of persuasion. Some academic debates, however, go beyond mere collegial disagreement, but can see a dominant orthodoxy engaging in not just career-thwarting pressure on dissenting colleagues, but can also actually stifle inquiry and advancement in their fields. This is, as physicist Lee Smolin argues, a sociological issue. He writes, "The problems are rooted in the way the career and funding structures of the Academy reward Me Too science, lack of courage, entrenchment of failed research programs, legacy building, empire building, narrowness, defensive strategies, and groupthink." In addition to these orthodoxy-reinforcing structures, the critical turn in the humanities has also led to ideological preoccupations in the Academy with identity politics and safetyism, with direct and troubling consequences for the study of Shakespeare. According to the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, Shakespeare has been gradually vanishing from university classrooms. In 2007, only 15 of 70 institutions surveyed required the teaching of Shakespeare, while in 2015, they found that a mere 4 of 52 colleges and universities required English majors to take a course on Shakespeare, focusing their curricula instead on matters of race, gender, politics, contemporary issues, and popular culture. It shouldn't surprise us then to see these currents reflected in the broader culture. The movement driven by both activists and activist scholars to decolonize, disrupt, and dismantle the curriculum has been especially detrimental to Shakespeare as the epitome of the dead white male. There are growing calls to decolonize Shakespeare, to reframe his works to make them, as one observer put it, less terrible, or just to stop teaching him altogether, notably through the #DisruptText campaign. I think the fact that this view is becoming an increasingly significant front in the culture war is, at least in part, a potent and unintended consequence of the utter biographical vacuum at the heart of the canon, and the corresponding sanctification of Shakespeare as Harold Bloom put it, a mortal god. And it is this conception that I believe lies at the heart of our wicked problem. Which leads us to a meta question. Is this an authorship question or an ontological question? For centuries, Shakespearean hagiography has argued that Shakespeare's exceptional, miraculous genius was innate and owed to the grace of nature. This ideology of Shakespeare's natural genius was famously declared by David Garrick's Ode to Shakespeare, recited at the 1769 Stratford Jubilee. "'Tis he, that demigod, who Avon's flowery margin trod, while sportive fancy round him flew, where nature led him by the hand, instructed him in all she knew, and gave him absolute command. 'Tis he, the god of our idolatry." Such did this notion of Shakespeare's communion with a personified nature take hold of the English imagination that by 1826 Henry Mercer Graves would, in his Essay on the Genius of Shakespeare, call the poet a child of nature herself. There is no better manifestation of this mythology than the painting, The Infant Shakespeare Attended by Nature and the Passions, by George Romney. This notion of the unlettered or natural genius was, in 18th century England, a distinctly ideological and nationalist project, where in previous centuries conventional wisdom held that genius must be enhanced by education and experience. English writers of that century instead proposed a new view, that formal education would only impede the work of such a genius, with Shakespeare being the prototypical example. As Jefferson Carter explains in his doctoral dissertation, The Unlettered Muse, the Uneducated Poets and the Concept of Natural Genius in 18th Century England, although the sublime of Pindar and Homer were mentioned in 18th century discussions of Shakespeare, the great dramatist played a role in the history of natural genius distinct from other aesthetic considerations. Shakespeare's influence on the idea of natural genius originated with his own contemporaries, an Englishman, and the modern. He transmitted the idea to following generations in a specially vital way. Carter affirms that this radical view of genius would become well established among England's literati in the 1700s, stressing the essential importance of the Englishness of this conception of genius. The synthesis of such insubstantial forces as nature and imagination have become what passes for conventional wisdom in Shakespeare's studies down to our own time. Harold Bloom, for example, wrote in his 1994 book, The Western Canon, that Shakespeare, quote, has the largeness of nature itself, end quote, while affirming John Milton's appraisal of the bard as nature's own artist. James Shapiro, meanwhile, chastises skeptics of the traditional attribution in his 2010 book Contested Will for their failure to appreciate the all-encompassing power of imagination to account for Shakespeare's accomplishments, an equally miraculous material cause all but synonymous with nature. In offering an ostensibly secular explanation for the seemingly inexplicable, the power of an embodied and often capitalized nature gave the Shakespeare scholar precisely what was needed in the face of the desolating absence of evidence, a rhetorical tool with which to defeat any possible objection. However, we understand that the notion of Shakespeare's natural genius, or that he was a child of nature, inherited the pantheism of 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza, which, as American philosopher Matthew Stewart argues in his 2014 book, Nature's God, held that, quote, God and nature are two ways of talking about the same thing, end quote, an idea which would constitute, as he says, the core religious sensibility of the Enlightenment. Or as historian of ideas P.M. Hyman put it, God's, quote, divine causality manifested in the active powers which were immanent in the fabric of nature, end quote. This notion of divine causality and nature requires some explanation and is, I think, of fundamental importance to achieving our meta-understanding of the authorship debate. In Book 2 of his Metaphysics, Aristotle proposed a pluralist view of causation, that there were 4 different types of causes for objects and events: material, efficient, formal, and final. The material cause is innate, referring to a thing's inherent qualities. The efficient cause involves agency, an antecedent-consequent relationship between an initiating actor or action and another object, i.e. A causes B to happen. The formal cause relates to the structure of a given thing, the form it takes in the world, while the final cause relates to a teleology, an ideal end state towards which that thing is working. How do Aristotle's causes apply to the authorship question? Stratfordians and Oxfordians would both agree that the author's talent was innate, that there is definitely a material cause at play. Oxfordians, however, argue for the essential role of the environment, the structural factors, including the unique and unrepeatable circumstances of Oxford's situation, education, and upbringing in the highest echelons of Elizabethan society, in nurturing his material talents. As such, their authorial model also forwards a formal cause. Stratfordians, however, deny any substantive role for the environment, but instead have faith in nature, i.e. God, as the ultimate efficient cause in Shakespeare's ability to transcend his environment. At the heart of our wicked problem, then, is that our academic and cultural institutions have essentially inherited and are perpetuating a foundational conception of the author that quite literally invokes the hand of God to make possible. An appeal to nature/God confers upon the object an expression of divine will, and therefore makes it beyond contestation, and conveniently for Stratfordians, the conventional tools of historiography. But how should we understand such a belief? I propose that Stratfordianism be understood as a Rawlsian comprehensive doctrine. Just as Riddle and Weber said of wicked problems that, quote, a plurality of objectives in a multicultural society makes it impossible to pursue unitary aims, American philosopher John Rawls, in his 1993 book Political Liberalism, also argued that pluralist societies have among their publics many different, what he called, conceptions of the good, such that a single universal comprehensive doctrine can never satisfy all such conceptions and so must not, in a liberal society, be imposed. This is no niche view from obscure scholarly literature. John Rawls was an award-winning political philosopher whose ideas are cited in courts of law in both the US and Canada, and who is considered one of the most significant political thinkers of the 20th century. In a politically liberal society, Rawls wrote, individuals and groups of people are entitled to their own comprehensive doctrines which they believe to be true, comprising as they do religious faith or metaphysical beliefs and corresponding guidance concerning morality and proper social conduct, but that these so-called thick theories cannot be imposed on others. Instead, he argued, we are guided by our thin theories of political liberalism on which all can agree, such as individual liberty and autonomy, freedom of thought, freedom of speech and expression, intellectual freedom and academic freedom, procedural principles which allow diverse groups of people to share society together. In this light, I would argue that Stratfordianism constitutes a Rawlsian comprehensive doctrine because it combines a metaphysical belief with corresponding guidance on proper moral and social conduct. I refer to this doctrine in the book as the Stratfordian belief system, and which is comprised of 1. A propositional belief, P, that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon was the author William Shakespeare. 2. A second-order belief about that belief, that P is a certainty beyond doubt and beyond questioning. 3. A host of explanatory beliefs, each premised on faith and justifying the proposition. Natural genius, the miracle of imagination, and idealistic speculation, such as the lost years. 4. A reflexive belief that the believers in the proposition themselves are authoritative, and as such cannot be questioned about the proposition. Which leads to 5. An ethical belief that questioning the proposition is not just factually incorrect but immoral. And finally 6. A juridical belief that those who do question the proposition may be justifiably marginalized and punished. In adopting a faith-based understanding of the author, Stratfordian belief assumes a metaphysical view, not just of the author, but of reality itself, suggesting a form of agency beyond our mortal plane that chooses human vessels through which to express its will. Whether this view is sincerely believed or merely expressed as rhetorical hyperbole on the part of Shakespeare biographers, it nonetheless has infused Shakespeare with a numinousness that he is beyond human understanding, and a corresponding mystification of those who study him. In addition, the Stratfordian authorship model also holds a curious ideological bias disguised as egalitarianism, which argues that it is pure snobbery to doubt that genius could arise in common circumstances. What's paradoxical about this stance is that in positing a natural and near-divine genius, the Stratfordian model can offer nothing to which an individual can reasonably aspire. You're either blessed by natural genius or you're not. In this regard, Stratfordianism is again quasi-religious, employing language more suited for a pre-Enlightenment articulation of the divine right of kings, i.e. the very antithesis of egalitarianism. This renders its invocation of its common-born Horatio Alger hero more than a little hollow. The philosophical commitments inherent in the Oxfordian model are quite different, because Oxford is understood as a situated knower, whose natural talent was nurtured by the best education then available. He has no innate godlike advantage over the rest of humanity. The Oxfordian model is, as a result, much more compatible with a liberal understanding of institutions, such that they have the power to create the conditions under which natural talent can flourish and merit recognized, which are excellent and feasible aspirational goals for any society. In summary, the barriers facing the authorship question in mainstream institutions represent a wicked problem, comprised of multiple circumjacent characteristics, as well as institutional, sociological, and cultural and political forces, including ideologically motivated pressure to reduce or eliminate Shakespeare from the curriculum. Chief among these barriers is the Stratfordian conception of the divine William, which is no mere rhetorical hyperbole or the inspiration for florid prose, but if we understand the genealogy of the concept of natural genius, in a very real sense positions God as the ultimate efficient cause of the Shakespeare canon. The central tenet of Stratfordian belief therefore comprises a metaphysical comprehensive doctrine of the sort which, as John Rawls argued, should not be promoted by public institutions, but left to the consciences of individuals. Yet this conception dominates our cultural understanding of Shakespeare, reinforcing the academic groupthink and intransigence against skepticism, while at the same time is fueling a postmodern identitarian reaction against the canon itself, which threatens to undermine Shakespeare's central place in global cultures, and against which the traditional model has proved quite incapable of responding. I suggest that secularizing Shakespeare's biography by rendering this metaphysical model inadmissible in liberal institutions of education is key to addressing both of these wicked problems. Yes, those making these revolutionary claims against the centrality of the Shakespeare canon may also raise objections to an aristocratic Shakespeare in the person of Edward de Vere, but what they are rejecting now is the cultural centrality of an essentially religious figure, curated by an elite priesthood. We can agree with these iconoclasts on one thing. The godlike figure that is Shakespeare should be dethroned, but he must be replaced with an actual human being, and we Oxfordians are more than ready to supply such an author. By employing a model of Shakespearean authorship research and pedagogy, premised not only in sound epistemological and historiographic principles and practices, but on a fundamental respect for the conjoined freedoms of thought and belief, and which is therefore commensurate with and supports the aspirations and functioning of liberal institutions. Thank you very much for listening.